I never used to mind the silence of the desert. But that was before I learned what hides inside it. The heat out here isn't just a temperature, it's a weight. It presses against your chest until every breath feels like swallowing wool. I was 3 hours outside of Vegas, pushing my old 98 sedan way harder than I should have, when the first puff of white smoke drifted from the hood. Then came the sound. TCH, DCH, DCH, DCH. A rhythmic, metallic death rattle. I pulled over onto the shoulder of Route 63, a stretch of roads so empty it felt like the world had simply ended 10 miles back. I stepped out, and the silence hit me like a physical blow. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. Damn it, I yelled. My voice didn't even echo. It just dropped into the sand and died. I popped the hood. A geyser of steam hissed at me. A warning I should have taken more seriously. I was staring at a cracked radiator hose, wondering how many hours it would take to dehydrate when I saw him. He didn't drive up. He didn't roar down the asphalt with sirens or bright lights. He was just there. A rusted, matte black tow truck was idling 20 yards behind my car. I hadn't heard it pull up. I hadn't seen the dust cloud. It was like he had simply materialized out of the heat haze. A man stepped out. He was tall, uncomfortably tall, wearing grease-stained coveralls that looked like they were made of more patches than original fabric. He carried a heavy, steel toolbox in one hand. It clanked with a dull, heavy thud against his thigh as he walked. "Car trouble?" he asked. His voice was wrong. It sounded like two pieces of sandpaper rubbing together in a dark room. "Yeah," I stammered, wiping sweat from my eyes. "Radiator, I think. You're a lifesaver. I didn't think anyone worked this stretch." He stopped 3 feet away. I couldn't see his eyes. He was wearing a pair of those wraparound industrial safety goggles, the kind that are tinted a sickly, mirrored yellow. All I could see was my own distorted reflection, small, sweating, and terrified. "I'm the handyman," he whispered. "I fix things that are broken." He set the toolbox down. The sound it made wasn't the light clink of wrenches. It was a heavy, wet crunch, as if the box weighed 200 pounds. "I don't have much cash on me," I said, my survival instinct finally screaming at me to back away. "But if you can tow me to the next station." "I don't want your money," he interrupted. He reached out and touched the fender of my car with a gloved hand. His fingers trailed through the dust, leaving deep, jagged grooves. "I want to see how it works." He flipped the latches on his toolbox. Clack, clack. I looked down. Inside, there weren't any wrenches. There were things I didn't recognize. Long, serrated hooks, bone saws with rusted teeth, and a collection of heavy, steel bolts that looked like they were designed to be driven through something or someone very, very slowly. "Wait," I said, taking a step back. "I think I can fix it myself. I'll just wait for the AAA truck." "There is no other truck," the handyman said. He took a step toward me. The smell hit me then. It wasn't oil. It wasn't gasoline. It was the copper-sweet stench of a slaughterhouse in mid-July. "You're stalled," he whispered. "And when things stall, they start to rot." He lunged. I didn't think. I just lunged. My boots skidded on the loose gravel as I dove back into the driver's seat. My fingers were shaking so violently I could barely grip the keys. Behind me, I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of his boots. He wasn't running. He didn't have to run. "Start. Please start," I hissed, twisting the ignition. Cough, click, click. The engine groaned, a pathetic, dying sound. Through the rearview mirror, I saw the handyman. He was standing right behind the bumper, his yellow-tinted goggles reflecting the orange glare of the setting sun. He looked like a giant, predatory insect. He didn't grab the door handle. Instead, he reached for the trunk. The sound of tearing metal screamed through the cabin. With his bare, gloved hands, he peeled back the corner of my trunk lid like it was a sardine can. The car shuddered under his strength. Cough. Vroom. The engine caught. A cloud of black, acrid smoke billowed out, and I slammed the shifter into drive. I floored it. The tires spun, spitting gravel like shrapnel, and for a second, I thought I was free. Then, the back of the car heaved upward. He had grabbed the bumper. I felt the wheels spinning in the air, screaming, burning rubber into the void. Through the back window, I saw his face, or what I could see of it. His skin was the color of old parchment, stretched too tight over a jaw that looked dislocated. "Stay," he rasped. The word wasn't a command. It was a fact. Suddenly, the car slammed back down. He let go, but I didn't wait to wonder why. I buried the needle. I didn't care about the radiator. I didn't care if the engine melted into a puddle of slag. I just needed distance. I watched him in the mirror until he was just a black speck against the shimmering heat, standing perfectly still next to his toolbox. 5 miles, 10 miles. The temperature gauge was pinned in the red, the cabin filling with the smell of burning oil. I kept checking the mirrors. Nothing, just the empty, dead road. I made it. I whispered, my breath coming in jagged gasps. I actually made it. That's when I noticed the sound. Clink, clink, clink. It was coming from under the car, a rhythmic, metallic dragging. I looked at the passenger seat, and my heart stopped. There was a hole in the floorboards, a neat, circular hole, as if something had been punched through the metal from the outside. Then, a hand reached through. It wasn't a human hand. It was covered in a heavy, industrial glove, but the fingers were too long, the joints bending at angles that would snap a human wrist. It clutched a long, steel bolt, the kind I had seen in his box. The handyman hadn't just watched me drive away. He had attached something to my chassis. The car began to tilt. The steering wheel jerked violently to the left, tearing itself out of my grip. I slammed on the brakes, but the pedal went straight to the floor. The brake line had been cut. I was doing 80 miles an hour when the front left tire simply vanished. The car dipped. The rim hit the asphalt, sending a spray of white-hot sparks across the windshield. The world turned upside down. Crash. Glass shattered. Metal twisted. The sound was deafening. And then, absolute silence. I was hanging upside down, held in place by my seatbelt. Blood, my blood, was dripping onto the roof of the car. Patter, patter, patter. Outside, through the shattered window, I heard the sound of a heavy, steel toolbox being set down on the pavement. Thud. The first step of any repair, the sandpaper voice whispered from the darkness outside, is to dismantle the frame. Darkness, not the peaceful kind, the kind that has. Wait, I woke up not to a sound, but to a sensation. The feeling of icy, corrugated metal against my back. I was lying on my back, stripped to my underwear. My wrists and ankles, they weren't tied. They were clamped. I tried to move, and a white-hot spike of agony shot up my left arm. I looked down. Heavy steel industrial pipe clamps were bolted directly into the metal table I was on, locking my limbs down just above the joint. My breath caught. It was a choked, wet sound in the humid air. The air didn't smell like the desert anymore. It smelled of old grease, ozone, and the faint, sweet tang of rot that I'd smelled before. Drip, drip, drip. I rolled my head to the side. I was in a vast, cavernous warehouse. The only light came from a single, buzzing fluorescent bulb hanging directly above me. It cast long, dancing shadows into the corners, shadows that looked like they were reaching for me. The walls were lined with pegboards, but they weren't holding wrenches or screwdrivers. They held parts, human parts. Dangling from meat hooks were strips of tanned skin, drying like jerky. There was a row of jars on a high shelf. I couldn't see what was in them, but in the flickering light, they looked gray, and they were floating. In the corner, a stack of license plates. Arizona, California, Nevada. They were twisted and bent, thrown into a careless pile like garbage. My stomach heaved. Help! I screamed. My voice was raspy, broken. Is anyone there? Help me. Silence. Then, TCH-DCH-DCH-DCH. It was the same sound my dying engine had made. But it wasn't a car this time. It was the sound of something rolling unevenly across the concrete floor. The handyman stepped into the circle of light. He was still wearing the grease-stained coveralls. He had taken off the goggles. I wish he hadn't. His eyes were dead. They were the color of muddy water, wide and unblinking. His face was a patchwork of scars, old and new, some stitched together with thick, black industrial thread. Others left open, jagged and red. His mouth was set in a permanent, tight grimace, pulling the skin of his cheeks taut over his teeth. He was pushing a medical cart. On it rested his toolbox. "Sure," he said. The sandpaper voice was softer now, almost tender. He reached out with a gloved hand and stroked my forehead. I flinched, but the clamps held me fast. "You're making the engine. Revolutionary." He flipped the latches on his toolbox. Clack, clack. "You had a bad hose," he said, staring not at my face, but at my torso. "I'm going to replace it." He reached in a box and pulled out a long, black rubber tube. It didn't look like an automotive part. It looked synthetic. It was covered in tiny, sharp barbs that glistened in the lamplight. Then, he picked up a scalpel. Not a medical scalpel. It was a heavy-duty box cutter, the blade fresh and silver. "No," I whispered. "No, please. Don't." He didn't listen. He leaned over me. I could see the sweat dripping from his chin. I could see the absence of any light in his eyes. He placed the cold edge of the box cutter against my abdomen. "This," he rasped, "is just routine, maintenance." He pressed down. "Scream." I screamed until my lungs felt like they would burst. The pain was unlike anything I could imagine. A blinding, white-hot line of fire tearing through my skin. I thrashed against the clamps, the metal digging into my flesh, adding new pain to the old. The fluorescent light overhead hummed. ZZZZZZT, seemingly louder than my screams. Through the tears in my eyes, I saw him drop the box cutter. He picked up the black tube with the barbs. "Just tightening the connections," he whispered. And then he reached down. I will continue from the perspective of the trapped protagonist. The tension is at its peak. Chapter 4, The Modification. The pain wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was a place. A cold, bright room where everything was made of fire and jagged glass. I watched, detached, as he worked. My own shock was the only thing keeping me from blacking out. The handyman didn't use anesthesia. He didn't use care. He used precision. The human heart. He whispered, his face inches from mine. I could smell the stale coffee and dried blood on his breath. It's a faulty pump. He held the barbed black tube over the incision he had just made. My blood was dark, almost black under the buzzing fluorescent light. It pooled on the metal table, dripping off the edge with a rhythmic tap. Tap, tap. Too much friction, he continued, his eyes wide and unblinking behind those yellow goggles he had put back on. Too much. Emotion clogs the valves. Suddenly, he shoved the tube into the opening. It wasn't a human sound. It was the sound of a dying animal. The barbs on the tube caught on my muscle, tearing, hooking, anchoring themselves into my very being. "Stop, please, just kill me." I howled, my body arching against the steel clamps. The handyman paused. He looked at me, tilting his head like a curious dog. "Kill you?" he asked. He sounded genuinely confused. "I don't kill. I upgrade." He reached into his heavy toolbox again. This time, he pulled out a hand crank drill. It was old, rusted, the bit stained with a crust of something brownish red. "Your steering is sloppy," he muttered. He moved to my right arm. The clamp held my wrist so tight the skin had turned a bruised, sickly purple. He positioned the drill bit over the center of my palm. No. Scree. The sound of the drill bit hitting bone was the worst thing I have ever heard. It wasn't a clean sound. It was a wet, grinding screech. I felt the vibration travel all the way up my shoulder, into my teeth, into my brain. He had gone all the way through. I felt my mind starting to fracture. The edges of the room began to blur into a gray mist. I wanted to die. I prayed for my heart to just stop. But then, the heavy warehouse doors at the far end of the room creaked open. Creak. The handyman stopped. He didn't look toward the door. He looked at the ceiling, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. Another. Breakdown. He whispered. He dropped the drill. It hit the concrete floor with a heavy clang. Without a word to me, without finishing the repair, he grabbed his yellow goggles and his toolbox. He walked into the shadows, his heavy boots fading into the distance. Thud, 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 silence. I was alone. My arm was a fountain of agony. My stomach felt like it was filled with hot lead. But, for the first time, the clamps felt loose. The vibration of the drill, the force he had used, it had partially stripped the threads of the bolt holding my right hand down. I looked at the hole in my palm. I looked at the dark, empty warehouse. I had to move. If I stayed here, I wasn't going to be a man anymore. I was going to be a machine. Pain is a liar. It tells you that you can't move. It tells you that you're finished. But underneath the pain, there's something older, something raw. I stare at my right hand. The drill bit had left a jagged, smoking hole right through the center of my palm. Every time my heart beat, a thick, dark spurt of blood bubbled out. Pulse, pulse, pulse. The clamp was still there, but I could feel the wobble. The handyman had been too forceful. The bolt holding the steel plate to the table was stripped. Move! I hissed at myself. My voice sounded like it belonged to a ghost. Move! I shoved my hand upward. Grind! The sound of the stripped bolt screaming against the metal threads was like a saw blade in my skull. I felt the skin of my wrist tear, the cold steel biting into the bone, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Clang. The bolt snapped. My right hand was free, dangling uselessly, a mangled mess of meat and shattered bone. But it was free. I reached across my body with my ruined hand. The agony was blinding. I grabbed the release lever for the left arm clamp. It was slick with my own blood. My fingers kept sliding off. Grip it. I screamed inside my head. I wrapped my shirt around the lever and pulled. Click. The left clamp flew open. I was halfway there. But the legs were bolted down with heavy-duty U-bolts. I looked at the medical card. The handyman had left the bolt cutter there. It was 5 feet away. I rolled off the table. My legs, still clamped, twisted at an angle they weren't meant to go. I felt a pop in my hip. I didn't care. I hit the concrete floor with a wet thud. I was hanging by my ankles, swinging like a piece of meat in a cold locker. Drip, drip, drip. I reached for the card. My fingertips brushed the cold metal. Closer, just an inch. I grabbed the leg of the cart and yanked. Crash. The cart toppled over. The box cutter, the serrated hooks, the jars of gray, floating things, they all spilled across the floor. One of the jars shattered near my face. The smell, it wasn't just rot. It was formaldehyde and old lard. I grabbed a box cutter. I hacked at the straps on my ankles. I didn't care if I cut my own skin. I just needed to be untethered. Finally, I fell. I hit the floor, gasping for air, my body a map of scars and fresh wounds. That's when I heard it. From the far end of the warehouse, through the heavy doors, came a sound. Screech. The sound of tires on gravel. A car was pulling up. No, I whispered. Run, run. But they couldn't hear me. Then came the sound of the handyman's boots. Thud, thud, thud. He wasn't walking toward me. He was walking toward the doors. He was going to collect his next component. I crawled. I couldn't walk. My hip was a mess of fire, so I dragged myself across the cold, oil-slick concrete. I crawled toward the back of the warehouse, toward a small, rusted vent near the floor. I looked back one last time. The handyman was standing by the door, silhouetted by the moonlight. He was holding a heavy steel chain. "Welcome," I heard him rasp. "You're just in time for your overhaul." I shoved my head into the vent. The metal edges sliced my shoulders, but I didn't feel it. I was a machine now, a machine built for one thing: survival. I crawled into the dark, narrow pipe and prayed that the desert would swallow me whole before he realized his favorite project had escaped. The vent was narrow, and the rusted edges of the metal cut into my skin like teeth. Every inch I moved forward felt like I was pulling a mountain behind me. My right hand was useless, a dead weight that throbbed with every heartbeat. I forced myself to crawl, my lungs burning with the thick dust of the ventilation shaft. I reached the end of the shaft. The screen was loose, hanging by a single screw. I pushed it with my shoulder, and it fell into the sand with a soft thud. I tumbled out, landing face first in the dirt. The cold night air hit me. It should have felt like freedom, but all I felt was terror. I was in a graveyard of cars, dozens of them, stripped of their parts, their skeletons gleaming under the moonlight. This wasn't just a garage, it was a collection. I looked back at the warehouse. Through the cracks in the walls, I could see the flickering yellow light. And then, I heard it, a woman's sudden, muffled scream, the new victim. She was inside. I heard the heavy clank of the handyman's toolbox as he set it on the table, the same table where my blood was still drying. I wanted to run. Every instinct told me to disappear into the darkness of the dunes. But then I saw it. About 50 yards away, a silver SUV was parked near the entrance. Her car. The keys might still be in it. I started to crawl through the maze of wrecked vehicles. My breath was coming in ragged gasps. I passed a rusted truck, and my heart stopped. Hanging from the side mirror was a necklace, a small gold cross. I recognized it. It belonged to a girl who had gone missing from my hometown 3 months ago. He had been doing this for a long time. I froze. Slow, heavy footsteps were approaching on the gravel. The handyman wasn't inside the warehouse anymore. He was outside. He was checking her car, left the lights on. I heard him mutter. His voice was like stones grinding together. Wasteful, very wasteful. I pressed my back against the cold metal of a scrap heap. I could hear him breathing. It was a wet, heavy sound, like a broken bellows. He was less than 10 feet away from me. "I know you were out here," he whispered. I held my breath until my lungs burned. I saw his shadow stretch across the sand, long and distorted. He started to walk toward the scrap heap where I was hiding. I had no weapon. I had no strength. All I had was the box cutter I had stolen from his cart. I gripped the plastic handle with my left hand, my knuckles white. If he turned the corner, I would have one chance. Just one. Suddenly, a loud metallic bang echoed from the other side of the yard. The handyman stopped. He turned his head toward the sound. A stack of tires had fallen over near the warehouse. Glitch in the system, he growled. He turned away from my hiding spot and started walking toward the noise. This was it, my only window. I didn't run. I couldn't. I dragged my broken body toward the silver SUV, praying the door was unlocked. The sand felt like ice against my chest as I dragged myself closer to the silver SUV. Every movement was a battle against my own body. My right arm was a useless weight, trailing behind me in the dirt like a broken branch. I could hear the handyman moving somewhere in the graveyard of cars, his boots crunching on the gravel as he searched for the source of the noise. I reached the driver's side door. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would crack my ribs. I reached up with my left hand, my fingers slick with sweat and dirt, and pulled the handle. It clicked. The door swung open with a heavy, metallic groan. It sounded like a gunshot in the silent desert night. I froze, pressed against the side of the car, waiting for the heavy footsteps to come charging toward me. But the wind just whistled through the empty husks of the old trucks nearby. He had not heard it yet. I hauled myself into the seat. The smell of the interior hit me immediately. It smelled like vanilla air freshener and old fast food bags. It smelled like a normal life. It was a world away from the copper and grease of that warehouse. The keys were hanging in the ignition. I reached out to turn them, but my hand was shaking so violently I could not even grip the plastic. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the roar in my ears. I looked in the rearview mirror, and for a split second, I saw my own reflection. I did not recognize the man staring back. My face was pale, smeared with grease and dried blood, my eyes wide and bloodshot. I gripped the key. I twisted it. The engine groaned. It struggled, the battery gasping for life. My heart stopped. "Please," I whispered. "Not now." I twisted it again. This time, the engine roared to life, the sound echoing off the metal walls of the surrounding scrap heaps. A shadow moved in the darkness ahead. The handyman appeared in the glare of the headlights. He did not flinch. He did not run. He just stood there, 50 feet away, holding a heavy iron pry bar in one hand. The light from the SUV reflected off his yellow goggles, making him look like a demon rising from the sand. He started to walk toward me. Slow, deliberate. He knew the gate was closed. He knew there was nowhere for me to go. I slammed the shifter into reverse. The tires spun, throwing a massive cloud of dust into the air. I backed up, swinging the front of the car around until I was facing the main road. The handyman stopped. He raised the iron bar and pointed it at me. "You cannot leave the shop," he yelled, his voice rising above the roar of the engine. "You are not finished yet. You are still broken." I did not answer. I floored the pedal. The SUV lunged forward. The handyman did not move. He stood his ground, bracing himself as if he intended to stop the 2-ton vehicle with his bare hands. At the last second, he swung the pry bar. The metal bar smashed into the windshield, spider webbing the glass directly in front of my face. Shards of glass sprayed into the cabin, cutting my forehead, but I did not let go of the wheel. I felt a heavy thud as the bumper hit him. He was thrown over the hood, his body rolling across the roof with a sickening thud before he vanished behind me. I did not look back. I sped toward the chain-link fence at the edge of the yard. I closed my eyes and braced for the impact. The car smashed through the gate, the metal screaming as it tore away from the posts. I was on the road, the open, empty road. I kept the pedal to the floor, my eyes fixed on the black ribbon of asphalt ahead. I drove for miles, the engine screaming in protest, the wind howling through the shattered windshield. But as I reached for the radio to try and find a signal, I felt something. A cold, rhythmic vibration coming from the seat beneath me. It was a soft clicking sound. It was not the engine. It was coming from the back seat. I looked in the mirror. The handyman's toolbox was sitting on the floorboards behind me, and the latches were open. The sound was coming from the darkness of the back seat. It was a slow, metallic clicking. My breath hitched to my throat. I looked into the rearview mirror, but the cabin was filled with shifting shadows. I could only see the glint of the silver toolbox. It sat there, heavy and cold, like a tombstone in the back of the car. I slammed my foot on the accelerator. I wanted to put as much distance as I could between myself and that graveyard of rusted steel. The wind screamed through the shattered windshield, stinging my eyes with dust and glass. I was bleeding, my body was broken, but I was moving. I was almost free. Then, the clicking stopped. A hand reached over the top of the seat. It was covered in a thick, grease-stained glove. The fingers were impossibly long. They gripped the leather headrest, squeezing until the material groaned. He had never fallen off the roof. He had climbed in through the back window when I smashed through the gate. "You are not finished," the voice rasped. It was right behind my ear. The smell of copper and old oil filled the small cabin. You were still leaking. You were still inefficient. I didn't think. I gripped the steering wheel with my one good hand and yanked it to the side. The SUV swerved violently across the empty road. The tires screamed as the vehicle tilted on two wheels. I heard a heavy thud as the handyman was thrown against the door. I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded, spinning in a circle before it finally came to a halt in the middle of the dark highway. Silence returned to the desert. The only sound was the clicking of the cooling engine. I fumbled for the door handle. I had to get out. I had to run into the dunes where he couldn't see me. But before I could move, the seatbelt tightened across my chest. It didn't just lock. It began to retract. It pulled me back against the seat with a force that crushed the air out of my lungs. I looked down. The handyman was leaning forward, his hand gripping the mechanism of the belt. "Safety first," he whispered. He brought his other hand up. In it, he held a long, thin needle. It was attached to a tube that led back into the depths of his toolbox. The liquid inside was a thick, glowing green. I fought him. I bit his hand. I kicked to the dashboard, but the belt kept tightening. I couldn't breathe. My vision began to swim. The stars outside the window started to blur into long, white streaks. "I am the handyman," he said, his voice almost a lullaby now. "I fix where the world breaks. And you, my friend, were broken the moment you stepped onto my road." He leaned in close. His yellow goggles were gone. His eyes were nothing but empty, dark holes. I felt the needle sink into my neck. It was a cold, sharp sting. Then, a strange warmth began to spread through my veins. The pain in my hand vanished. The terror in my heart died. Everything became very quiet. Everything became very still. I looked down at my hands. They didn't look like skin anymore. They looked like polished chrome. My fingers moved with the sound of tiny, perfect gears. I wasn't bleeding. I wasn't hurting. I looked at the handyman. He was smiling. It was a jagged, terrible expression. There, he whispered, "Now, you're perfect. Now, you can help me fix the others." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply reached out and gripped the steering wheel. My new hands felt strong. My new heart beat with the steady, reliable rhythm of a clock. I put the car in gear. We drove back toward the warehouse, two shadows moving through the moonlight. The road was long, and we had so many more things to fix.